Welcome to Say the Question. I'm Joe, here with Sam, and today we're asking about that little sentence that can turn a real problem into a moral test. When someone says, "You should have asked," after the thing was already missed.
Yeah, because that answer can hide a lot. Invisible labor is real work, but it gets treated like it was never work at all, especially when nobody named it in the moment.
Right, and that's the trap. Sometimes asking is the fair move, but sometimes it's just a way to dodge noticing what was already being carried. So let's start with the starting take. Sam, start us off.
Before we get too polite about it, I think the first thing is that "you should have asked" is not just a communication tip. Sometimes it's a clean little escape hatch. It's the kind of phrase people use when they want to sound reasonable while quietly dodging the part where they were supposed to notice something in the first place.
It can be. But I'd separate the cases where somebody genuinely didn't know from the cases where they absolutely knew the room was on fire and are now acting like your silence means they had no responsibility. Those are different situations, and people love flattening them into one neat little excuse.
Yeah, that's the move. The phrase sounds innocent, but in real life, it can mean I saw the problem, I understood it was a problem, and I'm going to act like your silence absolves me. That's why people hear it and immediately get mad, even if they can't always explain why.
That's the sharp version. The softer version is that people really do miss things, and they can't fix what they never heard. But the hard question is whether the problem was actually invisible or just inconvenient to acknowledge. Those are not the same thing, and the difference matters a lot.
Exactly. There's a big difference between "I had no clue you needed that" and "you were clearly drowning, but apparently you didn't file the proper request," which, by the way, is how adults sometimes talk as if they're a service desk and everyone else is opening a support ticket just to participate in life.
Please do not give anyone in management ideas. But that joke works because it points at the real irritation. A lot of invisible labor is exactly that, invisible. Somebody has to notice the thing, name the thing, and often chase the thing down before anyone else will admit it exists. That burden falls unevenly.
Right, and that's where this gets sticky in families, relationships, and workplaces. Some people are treated like the default monitor for the whole room. They're supposed to anticipate, remind, smooth over, and translate everybody else's vague discomfort into a concrete request. Meanwhile, somebody else gets to stand there and say, very earnestly, "Well, you never asked."
And that's why people bristle. The complaint is often not, "I refuse to communicate." It's, "Why is the burden always on the less powerful or less supported person to notice the missing piece, name it clearly, and then make the request in the first place?" That's not a small complaint. That's the whole problem a lot of the time.
So the issue isn't just asking, it's whether asking is being used to make noticing optional. Joe, am I overstating that? Or is that really the pressure point here? Because to me, that's the part people get defensive about fastest.
That's the pressure point, yes. Adults do need to speak up sometimes, and there are plenty of moments where nobody can help you unless you actually say what you need. But adults also do not need a scavenger hunt every time they want basic support or a shared standard to be followed.
And that's the part people miss when they make it sound like communication is the whole story. There are situations where the ask should be explicit, fine. But there are also situations where the need is obvious enough that pretending not to see it is its own choice.
That's the cleaner distinction. If the need is hidden, ask. If the need is obvious and the person with more control is hiding behind procedure, then "you should have asked" isn't advice, it's a shield. The problem is when people use a fair rule in an unfair setting and then acts surprised that everyone can feel the dodge.
And that's why the phrase lands like a knife twist. It can be totally fair in one case and totally evasive in another. And people know the difference, even when they pretend they don't. Nobody is actually confused about every single situation. They're usually confused about whether they're being asked to accept a setup where only the person with the problem has to do the work.
Mostly, yeah. The cleanest version is that "you should have asked" can be a real boundary when someone genuinely didn't know what was needed. But it turns into a dodge when the need was visible, the power was unequal, and the person with more control is trying to make their own inattention sound like respect. That's the version people are reacting to.
So we're not saying asking never matters. We're saying the phrase gets suspicious when it's used to make other people carry the whole mental load and then act grateful about it. That's the annoying little social trick in the middle of it all.
Yeah, and that's the line worth testing. Sometimes the phrase is a fair limit. Sometimes it's a socially acceptable way of saying, "I didn't want to notice until you made me." The next question is why that hits such a nerve, and what people think they're protecting when they say it.
Okay, but before we get too tidy about it, this is why the phrase already feels off to people. When someone says, "you should have asked," it doesn't land like helpful advice. It sounds like the burden just got moved sideways, and the person who missed the need is suddenly acting like they were the one doing the reasonable thing.
That's the part people react to. It sounds less like a fix and more like a cleanup job after the fact, where the missing support gets translated into a communication failure instead of a noticing failure.
Right, and that is what makes it feel defensive. Because in a lot of real life, the problem is not that nobody used the magic phrase correctly. The problem is one person was already keeping track of the thing, and the other person was waiting to be told like this was a hobby and not a shared responsibility. If one person is tracking appointments, meds, school forms, groceries, birthdays, and all the little follow-up stuff nobody praises, then "you should have asked" starts to sound like
the person doing none of the tracking is grading the person doing all the tracking. And that matters because the phrase can do two things at once. Sometimes it really is about coordination, but sometimes it lets somebody avoid saying, "I didn't notice, I didn't take initiative, and now I want that to sound mutual."
Yes, and that's the annoying part. It takes a miss and turns it into a manners lesson for the person who got missed. So instead of "I dropped the ball," you get, "Well, why didn't you make me be decent in advance?" That's a pretty slick little rewrite when you hear it out loud.
So what part of that is the real offense to you? The task itself getting missed, or the way the phrase makes the miss sound normal?
It's the second part mostly. The task can be annoying, sure, but the deeper sting is that the phrase makes invisible work disappear. It says the labor only counts if it got formally requested, which is a nice way to pretend nobody was already doing the mental bookkeeping in the first place.
And that's the cleaner version of why people get heated. Invisible labor is real work, even when it doesn't look like a task on a checklist. In caregiving, that can be the appointments, the meds, the shopping, the housework, the rides. In households more broadly, it is often the remembering and anticipating that nobody sees because the mess never happened out loud.
That's what makes it hit a nerve in office life too, by the way. The same move shows up when one person is always the one who notices the deadline, sends the reminder, fixes the schedule, and somehow becomes the human backup system for everybody else.
Yeah, and in that setting, it can get dressed up as professionalism. Just ask if you need anything sounds courteous. But if the person saying it is also the one who never checks in, never anticipates, and never follows through unless prompted, then the niceness is doing a lot of work.
So, am I overstating it if I say the phrase is often less about communication and more about shifting the cost of noticing onto the person who already had too much to notice?
No, that's the useful version of the complaint. The line is whether asking is a fair coordination rule or a dodge for making someone else carry the anticipation. If both people genuinely share the tracking, then explicit asking is normal. If one person has quietly been the default organizer, then you should have asked is basically asking them to absorb the failure too.
And that's why it feels so personal, even when it's about something small. It's not just, I forgot the thing. It's, I forgot the thing, and now I'm pretending the system was fine. That is the part people hear as dismissive, because it erases the work that was already being done in the background.
Exactly. So the next question is not whether people should ever ask for help. It is when the ask is a normal part of shared responsibility and when it is a way to dodge the much less flattering job of noticing in the first place.
Okay, before we start judging anybody, we need cleaner words. People use help, asking, noticing, and should have known like they all mean the same thing, and they really don't. If we don't split them up, the whole argument turns mushy.
That's the first useful split. There's explicit asking, where somebody says what they need. There's noticing, where the other person sees the need without being told. And then there's initiative, which is the extra step of doing the coordination work before anybody has to chase you down.
So the annoying phrase isn't really about one thing. It can mean, you didn't ask, or I didn't notice, or I noticed and still didn't do anything, which are very different problems.
Exactly. And people keep sliding between those like they're interchangeable. If I genuinely didn't know you needed something, that's one conversation. If I knew, but waited for you to manage the whole thing, that's a completely different one.
Right. And the phrase gets slippery because it sounds neutral. You should have asked can mean, I had no clue. Or it can mean, I wanted you to do the coordination work so I could stay comfortable. Those are not the same moral claim, even if people say them with the same calm face.
That's where invisible labor comes in. It's work that matters, but it doesn't get recognized as work. Or it gets treated like part of normal life that nobody has to name. A lot of it is the remembering, tracking, anticipating, and following up that keeps everything from slipping.
And once you say that out loud, it gets less mystical. It's not just doing the task. It's carrying the task in your head until the task is real enough for everybody else to notice. That's where people start calling it annoying, when it's actually labor.
Yeah, physical help is one layer, but mental labor is the part where somebody has to notice the problem, decide what kind of help is needed, and keep the thing moving. That includes the boring stuff like reminders, timing, and making sure the plan is still a plan.
So if I say, why didn't you ask? I'm basically asking whether the need was obvious enough that asking was reasonable in the first place. Is that fair? Or am I already smuggling in a bias that the person should have been more explicit no matter what?
That's the right question. Because sometimes the need really was hidden, and sometimes it wasn't. A lot of adult life lives in that ugly middle, where one person thinks the signal was clear, and the other person honestly thinks they were expected to infer it without a manual.
Okay, but where do you draw the fair line? When is it reasonable to say, you should have asked, and when is that just a polite way of saying, I didn't want to be proactive?
I think the line is whether the need was obvious enough that a decent person would at least register it as a possibility. If the other person had no real way to know, asking matters. If the need was plain and the response was basically, well, you never explicitly demanded it, then that's not a communication issue so much as a dodge.
That's the useful distinction, because people love pretending every unmet need came with the same level of visibility. It didn't. Some things are obvious in the room. Some things only make sense if you already know the backstory. Some things were obvious and still got ignored because ignoring them was convenient.
And the practical test is whether there was enough information for support to happen without forcing the person with the need to do all the organizing. In workplaces, that's why a combination often starts with someone saying what they need, but the system also has to respond sensibly when the need is already clear. The basic idea is sometimes asking is necessary, sometimes noticing is enough, and sometimes the problem is that nobody wanted to take responsibility for either.
So the boring definition is asking is explicit, noticing is perception, and initiative is what you do after you perceive it. And invisible labor is what happens when the same person keeps getting stuck with the perception and the planning without anybody naming it as work.
That's the clean version. The messy version is that real situations mix all three, which is why you should have asked can be fair, unfair, or just a tidy way to avoid the harder conversation. Now we can finally test the polite answer against the real one underneath it.
Okay, so the polite version is easy enough. You should have asked, use your words, don't expect mind reading. That's the socially acceptable answer. The part worth poking at is when that line sounds like a clean rule, but it's really a way to avoid noticing anything until somebody else has already done the work of making it impossible to ignore.
That's the useful split. Sometimes it really is a boundary. I can't help with a need you never stated. But sometimes it's a shield against paying attention in the first place. And those are not the same thing, even if people use the same sentence for both.
Right, because just ask can be code for, please do all the labor of making the problem legible to me. Ugh. And that sounds reasonable in public. It feels a lot less generous when you're the one who had to notice, name, and translate the issue before anybody else even admitted it existed.
That's the sharper version, but I'd keep it conditional. If the other person genuinely had no way to know, then asking matters. If they noticed enough to benefit from the arrangement, but not enough to share the work, that's where it stops being a communication issue and starts looking like dodgy convenience.
And that is why the phrase gets so slippery. Just ask sounds neutral, but sometimes it's basically, I want the benefit of your need without the inconvenience of noticing the need. That is a very tidy sentence for something that often asks one person to carry the whole mental load.
Right, without doing the noticing.
Exactly. And to be fair, not every missed thing is somebody dodging work. Sometimes people truly do not know. And you can't blame somebody for failing to telepathically detect a need nobody named. I get that part. And I don't want to flatten it into everyone is secretly selfish.
That part matters. The issue is that people often hide behind the fair version to avoid the uncomfortable version. Tell me can be a sincere request, or it can be a way of saying, I will only participate after you have done the administrative work for me.
So where's the line then? Because ask clearly is fair when the need is actually invisible, but it starts to smell when the same person always acts like the problem didn't exist until it got named. At some point, you stop hearing a boundary and start hearing a refusal to notice.
That's the useful distinction. One-off misses are one thing, a pattern is another. If the response is, tell me and I'll help, that's cooperation. If the response is, I refuse to look up from my own comfort unless you file it correctly, then the sentence is doing cleanup for them.
And you can see how that feels in ordinary life, not just in some dramatic argument. Think about a shared apartment. One person keeps noticing the paper towels are gone, the trash is full, the bill is due, whatever. Then the other person, who never seems to notice anything until it's already a problem, gets to sound reasonable by saying, "You should have asked me."
Yeah, and that's the part people resent. Not because asking is evil, but because the person who did the noticing first is suddenly being treated like the difficult one. The person who stayed oblivious gets to wear the costume of reasonableness, which is a nice trick if you can pull it off.
That's exactly it. The phrase can be fair, but it can also be a way of making somebody else carry the burden of awareness and then acting like that burden was always their job. So the real question isn't just whether they asked, it's whether this is boundary setting or responsibility shifting. Okay, so with the polite version and the rude version both on the table, I think the real argument is this. One side is saying, just tell people what you need. And the other side is saying, why are we pretending nobody can see a mess when it's right there? Those are both real complaints. I just think the first one gets weaponized less often than the second one gets ignored. And that matters because it changes who ends up doing the work.
That's the better place to start. Because if you don't state a need, you are asking other people to guess. And guessing is a terrible civic virtue. In a lot of normal life, the fair baseline is say what you want, say what you can't do, and don't make everyone around you solve a puzzle you never gave them. That is especially true when the need is private, changeable, or not obvious from the outside.
Okay, but where would you draw the line? Because there are situations where nobody says anything, and one person still clearly knew more, saw more, or had enough context to realize something was off. That is when "you should have asked" starts sounding less like a neutral rule and more like a way to make the less powerful person do all the initiating.
I draw it at the difference between a private need and an obvious gap. If the need is personal, hidden, or genuinely ambiguous, then yes, asking is the honest move. If the gap is sitting right there in front of you, especially if you're the one with more context, then acting like you needed a formal invitation can be a dodge. Those are not the same thing, and people keep pretending they are because it's convenient.
Sure, but that only gets you halfway there. The reason people get annoyed at "you should have asked" is that it often comes after somebody had to notice the problem first, organize the fix, and then also do the emotional labor of not making you feel guilty about it. That's not just communication. That's one person quietly carrying the whole overhead for everybody else, and the other person calling that efficiency.
That's fair, but I want to separate burden from telepathy. Are you saying people should notice the obvious gap, or are you saying they should be expected to read every unspoken need on contact? Because those are different expectations, and one of them is reasonable, while the other turns into psychic assistant nonsense pretty fast.
Yeah, I'm saying the first one. The strongest version of my point is competence. If you're already standing in the room and the problem is obvious, pretending you needed a formal request can just be a way to dodge initiative. Grown-up environments reward the person who sees the gap, fills it, and doesn't wait to be managed. That's the person people trust, and for good reason.
And the strongest version of my point is that adults cannot live inside each other's heads. Once you decide that a responsible person should just infer your need, you've made your standard invisible and your disappointment unavoidable. Not every relationship is set up for constant scanning, and not every mismatch is evidence that somebody didn't care. Sometimes it's just a bad assumption meeting silence.
Right, and that's where the slogan gets slippery. If you say it to your coworker because you're not a mind reader, fine. If you say it every time you had more information, more authority, or a better view of the situation, then it starts sounding less like a principle and more like a cleanup crew for your own passivity. It becomes a way to act innocent after refusing to engage.
And the counter sentence is, if you never say anything and then punish people for not discovering it, you're making your standards private and your disappointment public. That's not fair either. So the honest version is probably not always ask or just notice everything. It's who had the clearer view? Who had the easier path to speak? And what level of initiative was actually reasonable here?
Yeah. So the fight isn't between independence and need, it's between fair communication and lazy offloading. And the annoying part is that both of those can show up in the same relationship, sometimes on the same day, which is why the slogan feels clean, but the real life underneath it is messier and a lot less flattering.
That's the useful standard, though. Don't require mind reading, but don't reward passivity either. If the need was hidden, say it. If the gap was obvious and you had the better vantage point, step in. That's not perfect, but it's a lot closer to honest than either slogan by itself.
Okay, but this is where the slogan gets lazy. People act like there are only two options. Either somebody has to read your mind, or you're supposed to operate like a fully self-contained adult with no expectation that anyone notices anything. That's a fake choice. Real life is full of situations where one person should notice, and other situations where the other person really does need to say it out loud.
That's the useful correction. The question isn't, should people ask for what they need? Of course they usually should. The real question is whether the need was private, whether it was repeated, whether it was obvious, and whether the other person was already supposed to be sharing that responsibility. Those are very different situations, and people keep flattening them into one little moral slogan.
And once it keeps happening, just ask starts sounding less like advice and more like a way to keep the burden on the same person.
Exactly. If it's a one-off thing, if the need is genuinely hidden, or if the person affected is the only one who can know what they need, then asking is normal. But if the same task, the same need, or the same pattern keeps falling to one person, then you should have asked stops being neutral. It can become a way of pretending the structure is fine when the structure is actually doing the work of avoiding responsibility.
So where does it stay fair? I mean, give me the version that isn't just a dodge, because people use that line for everything from genuine misunderstanding to, I didn't want to think about it until you got annoyed.
In a workplace, the fair version is usually pretty plain. People generally need to communicate needs, and even the formal accommodation process is built around that idea. But it also assumes the other side isn't allowed to play dumb when the need is obvious. So the clean rule is, if it's private or new, ask. If it's visible, repeated, or already shared, then the other person has some obligation to notice and respond without making you explain the whole world from scratch.
That's the part people keep skipping. At home, especially, one person can end up carrying the remembering, the tracking, the checking, the little mental notes that keep a household from falling apart. Then when they finally say something, they get told they should have asked earlier, like they weren't already doing half the invisible work. That's not just a communication glitch. That's somebody else treating noticing as optional.
That's the better version of the complaint. It's not, nobody should ever have to ask. It's, why is asking being used to cover for a pattern where one person is expected to be the radar? Once the same person is always the one remembering birthdays, scheduling, supplies, follow-up, or whatever the task is, The issue is no longer a missing sentence. It's an uneven division of labor.
Are you saying the phrase is only bad when the burden is already unequal? Or can it still be fair even then if the other person really had no way of knowing?
It can still be fair in a real sense if the need was actually hidden. That's the key part. Fairness doesn't disappear just because the result was annoying. But repetition changes the standard. In caregiving, for example, repeated care work can hit time, money, and health. So, just ask more clearly is not a complete answer. If the work is constant, the system needs structure, not endless improvisation.
Right. And that's why the lazy take annoys people. It treats initiative like a personality test instead of a context question. A one-time miss is one thing. Making one person the permanent memory for a home, a job, or a care situation is something else entirely.
So the usable rule is something like this. Ask first when the need is private, new, or genuinely hard to see. But when the need is repeated, shared, or obvious, then you should have asked starts to sound less like accountability and more like a refusal to participate. That's the line we actually have to draw next, because that's where fair expectation turns into unfair burden.
Okay, so the line is not just whether someone asked nicely, it's where curiosity turns into intrusion or where just ask becomes a way to dodge basic noticing.
That's the useful split. A private preference is one thing. A repeated, predictable need is another. People keep trying to flatten those into the same category, and they're not the same kind of problem.
Right, because if somebody needs help with a weird one-off, sure, ask. But if it's the same dishes, the same pickup, the same caregiving task, the same problem every week, then why didn't you say something start sounding like a dodge? Not always, but often enough to notice.
Mostly, yeah. The more visible and recurring the pattern is, the less impressive it is to act shocked by it later. At some point, you're not being respectful of boundaries. You're just staying uninvolved on purpose.
And that's the part people hate hearing, because it sounds like you're accusing them of bad character. I'm not even saying that every time. I'm saying there's a point where the social story stops being, I didn't know, and starts being, I preferred not to deal with it.
Exactly. Intent matters, but pattern matters too. One missed signal is a miss. 7 missed signals in a row starts to look like a choice, or at least like a very convenient level of not seeing.
What about workplaces, though? That's where people love to say, well, if you needed an accommodation, you should have said something. And then they act like that settles the whole conversation.
Sometimes that part is fair. If the need isn't obvious or obvious enough, the person asking for an accommodation generally has to communicate it. The employer can't read minds, and pretending they can is just bad information flow dressed up as moral judgment.
But that still doesn't give the other side a blank check. You have to ask is not the same thing as we get to ignore what's in front of us. If somebody is clearly struggling and the whole office can see it, at some point this is not about privacy anymore.
That's the clean version. If the need is private, sensitive, or genuinely unclear, ask first. If it's obvious, recurring, or already part of the shared setup, then the burden shifts. Nobody gets to hide behind, nobody told me, when the situation was sitting there in daylight.
And caregiving is where this gets really hard to fake. Because the CDC point about care plans makes sense. Shared systems reduce the burden of having to ask over and over again. If everything depends on the exhausted person remembering to request help at the exact right moment, that is not support. That's another job.
That's the part people skip. Constant self-advocacy is its own strain. And if you're already carrying work, family, or health pressure, asking in perfect language every time can become part of the load instead of the solution.
So the fair version is not never ask, and it's not always notice everything. It's more like, if this is private, weird, or not something a normal person could reasonably infer, ask. If it's a recurring duty, a visible problem, or a shared responsibility, don't make the other person build the whole bridge before you move.
That's the right line, and tone still matters. Why didn't you tell me can be a genuine invitation to clarify. It can also be a lazy way to make the inconvenience sound like the other person's moral failure. Same words, very different job.
So if I'm trying to be fair, the test is whether I'm respecting a boundary or just exploiting it. If I truly couldn't know, then you should have asked is reasonable. If I could have noticed, and I'm using that line to avoid care, effort, or responsibility, then I'm not protecting a boundary. I'm hiding inside one.
Yeah, that's the threshold I'd use. Ask when the need is private or unclear. Notice and step in when it's recurring, shared, or already visible. That keeps the complaint fair without turning privacy into an excuse for not paying attention.
Okay, so here's the ugly part. A lot of the thing we complain about, people not noticing, not helping, not taking initiative, gets fed by the way we act when we want something but won't say it straight. We say we want to be cared for, but we also want the other person to figure it out with very little to go on.
That's the uncomfortable bit, yeah. Not because every missed need is the needy person's fault, but because ambiguity can be a kind of shelter. If you never state the thing plainly, you never have to hear no, and you never have to admit the ask was specific.
And then everybody acts like this is some deep moral mystery. In families, at work, in group chats, people drop hints, wait, get offended, and then call it being misunderstood, when really they never made the request legible to begin with. We keep rewarding that little dance because everybody wants the benefit of being known without the risk of being direct.
There is a real difference between being ignored and being unreadable. Both happen, and sometimes the unreadable person is also the one who got ignored for a long time, so it's messy. But if the signal is vague by design, then the complaint can't just be, why didn't you know? Because know what exactly?
Right, and that's where the passive-aggressive version lives. People say, you should have known. But half the time what they mean is, I wanted you to notice my need without me having to risk hearing no. And honestly, that's a very human impulse. It's just not a clean way to organize your life.
No, that's fair. But I don't want to turn that into, well, everyone should just know better. Because some people were never taught how to ask plainly, or how to name a preference without feeling guilty about it. So part of this is bad habit, part of it is training, and part of it is people being scared of the answer.
Sure, but Joe, am I overstating it when I say we also train the other side? If the only time anyone gets credit is when they wait to be told, then adults start acting like initiative is rude. They sit there with their hands folded, and then everybody acts shocked that nothing happens unless someone spells it out.
I think that's the useful version of it. We do train people to pause until they get instructions, because a lot of systems punish guessing more than they reward noticing. At work, in some families, even in texting, the safest move becomes saying less, waiting longer, and asking for clarification only after the room has already gone stale.
And that gets reinforced everywhere, in jobs, at home, in the way people apologize after the fact instead of making the first ask clear. You can feel the logic of it. If being direct makes you look demanding, then people learn to dress need up as a hint and hope the hint lands. Then, when it doesn't, everybody is offended at the result.
Exactly. The person who wants something clear gets treated like they're making the room awkward, when really, they're the only one doing the work of being honest. That's what makes the whole thing so irritating. The direct person looks aggressive because everyone else has agreed to communicate by implication.
And there's a fairer version of the critique too. Some people really do complain about being unseen while also making themselves hard to help. They want support, but they won't say which support. Or they wait until the moment is past and then act like the missed chance proves nobody cared.
That's the part I want to keep. Not because it explains everything, but because it keeps us from outsourcing all of this to other people's supposed cruelty. Sometimes the problem is not that nobody noticed. It's that the thing needed was hidden behind politeness, resentment, or a test the other person didn't know they were taking.
Yeah, and then people build a whole identity around being hard to read, as if mystery is the same thing as depth. It isn't. If you want help, make the ask legible enough that another adult can respond. If you care about somebody, don't make them guess whether they should comfort you, fix something, or just leave you alone.
That's the practical standard, and it's good because it doesn't excuse either side. It says, stop rewarding guesswork, stop hiding needs behind disappointment, and stop pretending that adults are failing some sacred test when they were never given the actual question. The fix is usually more plain speech, not more psychic effort.
Okay, so if we're done pretending everyone can read the room by telepathy, what actually fixes this? Because I'm tired of the advice that amounts to be nicer and somehow more psychic.
The boring answer is the best one. Make the work visible. If a thing keeps falling on one person, that person shouldn't have to keep rediscovering the same problem from scratch every time. You need a shared default, not a repeated emergency.
So the fix is less ask better and more stop acting like hidden labor is invisible until somebody complains. That already feels more honest. If the task exists every week, the conversation should exist every week too.
That's the clean version. And it doesn't have to be dramatic. It can be a checklist, a shared calendar, a standing check-in, a default owner. Any system that prevents the same person from becoming the human reminder app.
The human reminder app is the whole disease, though. People love to act like you're being difficult for wanting structure when really you're asking them to stop making your brain do unpaid admin.
I buy that, but I'd put a boundary around it. Not every situation can be solved by one universal system. A caregiver, a coworker, a partner, a roommate, those all have different stakes. The point is not one perfect template. The point is reducing guesswork, where guesswork keeps hurting the same person.
That's fair, but there's still a norm problem. If you're the one who notices the mess, notices the deadline, notices the emotional temperature, and then gets told you should also have asked for help more clearly, that's not a communication issue. That's a distribution issue.
Exactly. And the reason that distinction matters is because it changes the fix. If the problem is genuine ambiguity, then you clarify. If the problem is one person carrying the attention load, then you redistribute it or write it down somewhere everyone can see. Otherwise, the same person just keeps becoming the warning system.
Joe, where do you draw the line between a fair ask and just outsourcing the noticing? Because that's where people get slippery. They'll say, you never asked, when the real issue is they were perfectly happy to wait until the mess became impossible to ignore.
The fair version is when the need is actually not obvious, and the other person couldn't reasonably know what was going on. The unfair version is when there's a pattern, the burden is recurring, and someone is acting like silence counts as no problem. At that point, you should have asked can become a dodge. It shifts the cost of noticing onto the person already doing too much noticing.
That's the part that always bugs me. If you make someone ask for every little thing, you're not building independence. You're building a system where the conscientious person does the mental labor and the rest of the room gets to stay pleasantly surprised by the bill.
And in caregiving, that's exactly why structure matters. Planning turns vague goodwill into actual responsibilities, which is the whole point. The CDC's care plan guidance is basically saying, don't leave people improvising every time life gets messy. Make the roles visible enough that nobody has to guess what counts as help.
Yeah, and once there's a plan, the same labor suddenly looks reasonable instead of needy. That's the social trick. Without structure, invisible work gets treated like personality. With structure, it becomes something real that can be shared.
That's the useful principle. In some workplaces, the better model is a simple back and forth. Ask what's needed, say what's realistic, follow up, adjust. The EEOC's accommodation guidance points in that direction. Not mind reading, not martyrdom, just a clearer process for figuring out support without making it a moral drama.
So the least bad version is don't make the vulnerable person guess what the system will tolerate, and don't make the helper guess what the need is. Everyone gets to use words. What a concept.
Words are annoyingly useful, yes, but the words have to be paired with an actual expectation that follow-up is normal. If someone asks for help and gets punished for asking, they learn to stay quiet until things break. That's how you manufacture invisible labor.
And if you're the person being asked, the standard should be simpler too. If this is recurring, don't hide behind one-off generosity. Either agree to a reliable role or say you can't do it. What's annoying is the pretending.
That's probably the cleanest usable rule. Ask early when the need is real, notice when the pattern is recurring, and build a system when the same burden keeps landing in the same place. Not perfect intuition, just less evasive adulthood.
Okay, so the clean landing is pretty simple. Sometimes you should have asked is fair, and sometimes it's just a way to dodge the part where somebody should have noticed. That's really what this whole thing came down to. Not whether asking is ever useful, but whether people are using that phrase to clarify a gap or to wash their hands of it.
That's the better version of the argument. The boring answer, which is usually the honest one, is that context does all the work here. If the need was hidden, unclear, or genuinely not something the other person could reasonably know, then asking matters. If the need was obvious, or if someone had enough information to notice and just didn't, then you should have asked starts sounding less like communication and more like self-protection.
Right, and that's why the slogan gets under people's skin. It acts like every missed need is some private little riddle only the needy person was supposed to solve. Real life is messier than that. A lot of the time, the issue is not that nobody said the exact words, it's that one person was clearly carrying the whole task of noticing, prompting, and following up.
And that's the piece worth keeping. Adults do need to ask sometimes, because nobody gets to be a mind reader by force. But adults also have to participate in the room they're standing in. If something is right there in front of you, emotionally, practically, visually, then pretending you needed a formal request is just a neat little escape hatch.
But if the need was sitting there in the open, then you should have asked starts sounding like a performance of
innocence. And that's usually the dodge.
Exactly. The fair version is people are not mind readers. but they also are not exempt from basic noticing. If you want the thing done right, it helps to say it. If the thing is already obvious, it helps to act like an adult and not wait for a neon sign.
So you're not saying the rule is never ask, just that people shouldn't pretend obviousness never counts?
Yeah, that's exactly it. I'm not asking everybody to intuit every need in the universe. I'm saying once the need is visible enough, the burden shifts a little. At that point, you should have asked can be true in a narrow way, but it can also be a very tidy way to avoid saying, I saw it and didn't step in.
That distinction matters. There's a real difference between I had no reason to know and I had enough reason to know but wanted a formal request so I could stay off the hook. And people blur those two on purpose because the second one sounds impolite when you say it plainly.
Which is basically the whole game here. The polite answer wants to treat every miss like a communication problem. The real answer is that sometimes it is, and sometimes it's a participation problem. Somebody wanted the other person to do the noticing work for them, and then acted surprised when that didn't magically happen.
And that doesn't mean the person who needed help gets blamed for everything. It just means the strongest version of the complaint is usually more specific. Say what was hidden, say what was visible, and say who actually had the chance to act. Once you do that, the slogan gets a lot less powerful because it stops being a universal defense and becomes a case-by-case question.
That's the part I want people to remember. If the need was hidden, asking is fair. If the need was obvious, you should have asked is often just a way to keep your own hands clean. And if you're an adult in the room, maybe the goal is less performance and more actually helping before somebody has to file a request form for basic decency.
That's the usable rule. Ask when the need is genuinely unclear. Notice when the need is plainly there. And don't use "you should have asked" to cover for a blind spot that was already obvious. Clearer asking, better noticing, less strategic helplessness. That's not a perfect rule, but it's a fair one. That wraps up today's question. Thanks for listening to Say the Question. Follow the show so you don't miss tomorrow's episode.